Welcome back to the Voices of the House of Zophiel. Today, we are really excited that we have the author Graham Phillips with us. Graham has been described as an historical detective, a modern-day adventurer, a real-life Indiana Jones. Whether you agree with his conclusions or not, Graham's findings are always original and thought-provoking, and his books make an exciting read. Graham has been one of best-selling non-fiction authors for over 30 years. In the 1980s, for example, after working as a radio journalist and broadcaster for the BBC and editing a popular monthly magazine, Graham turned to his talents to investigating unsolved historical mysteries. He has written 16 books that are in print around the world and is published in many different languages. For example, Graham has a background when he was working with the BBC that he was interested in things like strange phenomena. In fact, that's the title of the magazine going way back in time. He made a discovery and a controversial claim concerning things like Arthurian legends, such as the discovery of the Hawkstone Grail, a small stone cup that he claims is the original Holy Grail. Again, presenting some controversial theories, such as an alternative location for Mount Sinai at Petra in Jordan, and Egyptian stuff in the British Museum. An example of this would be the Staff of Moses. As you can imagine, Graham has never been afraid of controversy. In 1995, he made headlines around the world and created a storm in the Vatican that even involved the Pope himself when he discovered a lost artifact that may have been the original Holy Grail. His first solo book, The Search for the Grail, told the fascinating stories of modern-day great quests. More recently, Graham has a growing interest in megalithic structures in the British Isles. For example, his book, Wisdom Keepers of Stonehenge, to determine the precise time, which helps us plant and harvest medicinal plants. This also led to his newer book, The Mystery of Doggerland, Atlantis of the North Sea. This is about archaeological and scientific evidence of a preserved landmass that contains ancient, sophisticated technology. So hello, Graham. Let's talk about Doggerland.
Okay, well, I suppose I'd better, I'd better start by explaining what the megalithic culture is in Britain.
Wonderful.
All ties up with that.
Yeah.
Because the whole Doggerland thing is about where the megalithic culture originated.
Right.
So, short version is that megalithic culture are the people that built Stonehenge, but they also built hundreds, thousands of other stone circles throughout the British Isles, in Ireland, Britain, Scotland, all over the place. And there's still around, I think it's 12 to 1300 of these stone circles that still exist in various states of preservation. And they range from small ones for local communities, which may be made up of 10 or 12 stones, maybe 2 or 3 feet high in a circle, maybe 20 feet across, up to the very biggest, which are much bigger than Stonehenge. For example, Avebury, it's about 20 miles north of Stonehenge, which is, Stonehenge is about 100 feet across, the actual stone circle. Avebury is 1,000 feet across. Wow. It's made up of was originally over 100 stones, some of them weighing up to 40 tons. That was an outer circle. There were inner circles and other stone structures inside the circle. It's surrounded by a huge, great ditch and embankment that was originally about 40 feet deep and 40 feet high. Yep. People said, well, that was built for defensive purposes. But no, it couldn't have been, because the embankment is on the outside of the ditch, the wrong way round for defensive purposes. So it obviously had some mystical or spiritual or some other than defensive purpose.
Right.
And that's one of the largest stones, or if not the largest megalithic stone circle. But there are others like that throughout the country, which are quite large. Some of them almost the size of Avebury. And this was what they call a megalithic complex it was like, it would be like the cathedral to a church. An ordinary smaller stone circle would be like a parish church. And these big stone circles, like Stonehenge and Avebury, would be like cathedrals, if you like, serving larger communities. And they all had the same kind of general kind of build. You'd have a stone circle in the middle, surrounded by a ditch and embankment, and they were known as henges. The actual ditch and embankment is called a henge monument, which is where Stonehenge gets its name from, because it's surrounded by a ditch and embankment, although it's no longer as visible as some others. And then there were also avenues of stones that, in the case of Avebury, go for a couple of miles off in different directions. 6-7 feet tall stones, about 50 feet apart, 2 rows of them going away into the distance that lead to either smaller satellite stone circles or other arrangements of stones. And another thing that these megalithic complexes had was an artificial hill. There's one very close to Avebury called Silbury Hill. It's, I can't remember the exact height off the top of my head. I think it's something like about 300 feet high. It's pretty big. Yes. And it's been excavated by archaeologists. It's been studied with geophysics equipment. There's nothing inside it. It wasn't built as a tomb. There are no bodies there or structures. It's an artificial hill. And people say, well, maybe it's to look out over the horizon. Well, there's much bigger natural hills right next to it. So why build this thing? So all this complex of megalithic structures, as I say, is known as a megalithic complex. And then what you would tend to have is alignments of stones, maybe like every mile or so across the countryside, leading in pretty straight lines, going to other smaller stone circles, which would serve a local area. And this kind of thing was happening all over Britain, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, England. Now, this began around about 3000 BC. But by the time they were building these big stone circles like Stonehenge, that's about 500 years later. But some of the big ones are earlier than that. Now, it was always thought that this culture began from Brittany in northern France, because they had megalithic structures there. Carnac is an amazing, large complex of stone rows. There are huge standing stones, bigger than anything in this country, and there are all sorts of tombs, but there aren't the kind of stone circles or the kind of megalithic complexes I've just described there preceding what happens in this country. And for years, though, people thought, well, the stone circle building culture must have started in the south of England around Stonehenge and then gradually moved north, coming from France. But as I say, it doesn't seem to tie up with France. But okay, so maybe the people around Stonehenge invented it. But no, we know firstly that a lot of the stones of Stonehenge came from South Wales and were dragged all the way there. A stone circle existed in South Wales. It was basically taken apart, hauled across the countryside in some way, and then re-erected in the middle of what's now the Stonehenge that we know, before Stonehenge was built with all the arches around it. So it was obviously somewhere else in Wales and that before it was in Stonehenge. Okay, so where did it originate? Well, it's only recently that dating techniques such as radiocarbon dating of pottery by something called thermoluminescence, pollen dating, and other things like this have enabled to date what stone circles were built in what order. And then you think, well, how would they do this? Surely carbon dating only dates what was once living matter, bone, wood, that sort of thing. Well, what they do is they look what's under the stone. So they dig under one of the stones, and what was directly beneath it, maybe fragments of bone, maybe bits of wood or other charcoal, other things that were there when the stone was placed, they can be dated, and that tells us how old the stone circle is. And what was astonishing in recent years is that they discovered that the older stone circles are the ones further north, and the very oldest are on the Orkney Isles off the northern coast of Scotland, about 10 miles off the northern coast of Scotland. And the very oldest stone circle that they actually dated on land anywhere in the British Isles was on the Orkney Isles, and it's known as the Stones of Stenes, and that is about 3,100 BC, the very oldest. And the other stone structures and that megalithic monuments and complexes on the Orkney Islands are older than anything that came after it. So it seems to have started there.
Mm. I mean, obviously, these kind of sophisticated structures have some purpose and meaning, because otherwise they won't be here at all. And they've lasted a very long time. And I actually like that the farther north you go, the older they get, and therefore it presupposes there's something maybe more than this that we don't see. I'm just wondering where your interest started in this. I mean, what triggered that?
Years ago, myself and fellow author Andrew Collins, who will be interviewing or have already interviewed.
No, it's coming up.
It's coming up. We started investigating stone circles way back in 1980 or something like that. Right. And I at the time, we went to places like Avebury. I went to Normandy, Brittany and France, because I thought, okay, I'm going to see where this stone circle thing originated. And then when I got there, I thought, okay, I'm going to be seeing stone circles like Stonehenge or Avebury or these other smaller stone circles. And I didn't see any of those. There are stones placed in roughly circular shapes, but they're nothing like the stone circles you get here. And I was thinking, hold on, this didn't start here. It must have started somewhere else. Right. And I remember talking to various archaeologists at the time, and they said, oh, no, it started in France. And I said, the reason why I started to think it may have started up north is because, remember, I was talking about the stones from the Preseli Mountains, the blue stones in South Wales, were moved to what Stonehenge is now. In other words, the very first stones at Stonehenge, before the big ones all around the outside with arches, were dragged all the way from Wales. They may have been put on boats, on barges, or dragged across on rollers. However they got them there, they wanted to move a stone circle that already existed in South Wales and move it to where Stonehenge is when they decided to migrate. Now, it was fairly obvious at the time that there must have been an original stone circle, and people said, no, they just quarried the stones there. But since that time, they have found what was because they can look underground by using geophysics or by using radar and all sorts of other things like that. They can now see that there was a stone circle. They know where the stones were cut from that exactly matched the blue stones of Stonehenge. So there was a stone circle there already, and it moved. Then I found from a few archaeologists that were working there that they had found stones that were in stone circles in South Wales that they'd been moved from North Wales. And I thought, hold on, if you follow this through, it sounds like it's coming south.
Right.
And so I said, where's the, where somebody was telling me, oh, well, there's some very old stone circles up in Orkney. They didn't exactly know what age they were at that point. And then I thought, I reckon it must have started up here and come down south or in Scotland or something. And Andy and I were talking about this a lot. We went on the radio and talked about this. They didn't have, this sort of thing, podcasts and things like that. So they were on the old-fashioned radio and so on. And there was archaeologists who would not have it at all. But of course, now that's what the accepted thing is, and we don't really get much recognition for what we said years ago because, well, we're not archaeologists. But because we're not archaeologists attached to a university, we can basically come up with theories that would be considered almost heresy. And that's how I found out things about King Arthur, because if you're an archaeologist, you look into Arthurian legend, they'll basically throw you out of the college that you're at. Anyway, that's how it all started.
I mean, academia, I have some time for that, obviously, but I think that it does restrict people in terms of them being fluid with thinking. It's fairly rigid. I mean, it's rigid for a reason, but it's a system. And I think that we shouldn't fall into the trap of believing that if it's not tied to academia, we can't trust that. I think there are other ways of learning, really, and it's just one of those things. But I'm also harking back to, this idea of things going south from the north, and in the book, which is entitled, about Doggerland. Can you tell me something about that mystery? I mean, I want people to read the book, actually, Graham, but people should read books. However, it'd be kind of nice for you to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure, no problem. The thing about it starting on the Orkneys, okay, it was there before it was in the south and in England and so forth, but and it moved south. But did it actually start on the Orkneys, or did it come from somewhere else?
Right.
Did it come from Scandinavia? Well, there's nothing like the stone circle building culture anywhere in Scandinavia or elsewhere in Northern Europe. So, okay, so it seems to have started on the Orkneys. But the interesting thing is it started virtually with, when you actually get a culture that gradually sort of builds some things, it through trial and error, it gets better. But
Right.
what happens on the Orkneys, it suddenly starts knowing how to build these structures without any kind of like a build up to it. They just start building great big things. Okay, but it's not just that. It's the kind of houses they lived in, the kind of settlements they had on the Orkney Islands. So there's an extraordinarily well preserved ancient Neolithic settlement dating back maybe as long as 5,000 years, which was preserved because it was covered in sand due to a freak storm like 4,500 years ago. And it's preserved, and it's these buildings that they're built underground. There's all sorts of stones around to keep the earth back.
Yeah.
Just the roofs were visible above ground. They were connected by a series of tunnels. In other words, they were well made for living in a harsh environment like the Orkneys, where you've got the weather coming off the Atlantic and being pretty cold sometimes, certainly windy and wet. So they were under, but these particular dwellings, they've got a sophisticated plumbing system. In other words, I mean, they didn't have pipes, but they've got toilet facilities with running water going through. They've got fresh water coming from between these buildings in troughs. I mean, these people were extraordinarily advanced compared to other people elsewhere in the British Isles who were living in basically mud huts.
Yeah.
So, but to be able to build what they built and to create the kind of roofs that were made out of various types of seaweed and other stuff to stay up in the wind, and that took a lot of development. I mean, you couldn't go there. I couldn't just go up there and build one of these things overnight by just working it out. It takes years of practice.
Right.
But they suddenly built this. There's no evidence of them gradually getting to that point. And there's something else as well that they suddenly were able to do. There's a type of pottery which is typical of the megalithic period, and that is called corded ware. Basically, it's a kind of pot that's much more sophisticated than what was being made elsewhere in the British Isles, because it's stronger, it's more durable, because it's actually fired at a much higher temperature.
Right.
Now, to do that, you need to build pretty sophisticated kilns. And those sort of things were not known outside the Middle East at this point. Egypt and Samaria, places like this. It wasn't known in this part of the world. So they suddenly started having these sophisticated kilns and sophisticated pottery. And there's one more thing I'll mention. There's more than just this, but also when archaeologists have actually looked in, they found these pots buried in the tombs of the people that were living on the Orkneys at that time. They found that some of these pots, people were buried in these tombs, and in the other part of the tomb, they'd have grave goods, things that they used in everyday life.
Right.
And these people seem to have been healers, because these pots contained medicinal substances, things that you wouldn't eat for pleasure, or you wouldn't even take them to get high. They are poisonous unless taken in the right kind of dosage, and they've been identified as things that can cure parasites, worms that people have, cure stomachache, aid digestion, analgesics to stop pain. There's even something that they were using which seems to be a cure for certain types of cancer that is only being used now in forms of chemotherapy.
Yeah.
So these people have medicinal knowledge years ahead of their time, but they suddenly just were there. So this culture suddenly comes into existence about 3100 AD. BC, 3,500, over 5,000 years ago, suddenly comes into existence with these building techniques and this advanced knowledge of medicine and pottery making and that. It had to have started somewhere else, and these people came to the Orkneys sometime just over 5,000 years ago. The question then is, where did they come from? And this is where Doggerland comes in.
Okay. I mean, there's again, that word sophistication comes up quite clearly. I mean, we've got medicines, understanding the difference between stuff that is kill or cure. We've got structures that hold up ceilings and roofs, which is complex engineering as it is. We've got, did you call it cordware? It's kind of that kind of structure. Takes me back to art school, actually. Quite interesting. Where I was really rubbish to ceramics, but I watched some people create large vessels, but the core structure gave it that kind of
it held it together more, didn't it?
Yeah, it's that structural circular mass that can keep it together and stops it breaking. And then, of course, how do you fight such things? So we've got water and navigation of that within living communities, and we've got the use of intense heat and being able to control that, etc., and protection from the weather, and it goes on. I mean, there's that kind of society just beggars belief sometimes, and we think we're kind of sophisticated now, but we could argue against it looking backwards. So yeah, tell us a bit more about Doggerland.
Okay, so if it doesn't come from the south and it doesn't come from Scandinavia, where did this civilization come from? Well, what happened at the end of the last ice age, about between 10 and 12,000 years ago, is that the ice until that point covered most of Britain, right down to the Thames. In North America, it went down to the Great Lakes, I believe.
Right.
There was ice everywhere. And this ice was really thick. It's not just a glacier. We're talking about ice sheets, like you get covering the center of Antarctica or Greenland, that sort of thing. And this ice over Britain was about 2 miles thick, not at the very edges, but when you went up, 2 miles. Anyway, when all this started to melt, when the ice started retreating, there's all sorts of theories about why it got warmer. I won't bother going into those, but it's probably to do with the Earth slightly changing on its orbit around the sun or its axis or something. But anyway, something changed, it got warmer, and the ice started to melt. Well, this water ice has got to go somewhere, and it goes into the sea, and sea levels rise. And in fact, astonishingly, the sea levels at the end of the last ice age, before it started melting, were 400 feet lower than they are today worldwide. I mean, that meant there was a lot of people because at that time, people had started, after around 10,000 BC, had started to form early civilizations. They weren't as advanced as the Egyptians, but there were large communities of up to about 1,000 people that are the people who were building Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. There was a lot of coastal settlements that were literally flooded out and are now deep, and people have just kind of like don't even know to what extent these proto-civilizations had advanced to. But okay, so the sea levels rise, and until this time, Britain was joined to continental Europe by dry land. And it's known as Doggerland, named after Dogger Bank, which is an area of shallow water in the middle of the English Channel, or the North English Channel.
Yeah.
What then happened is that this Doggerland gradually sank, and it was always thought that the last part of Doggerland to sink below the waves was what is now Dogger Bank. Sort of, if you kind of go off the coast of Norfolk and Lincolnshire, and you go towards what's the other side, Holland or something, that's middle there is basically where the last part of Doggerland was thought to be. Sank around about 8,000 BC or something like that. But it is now known, and again, it's only recently that they're able to discover this, that the last part of Doggerland to sink was a sizable island, perhaps about half the size of Wales, which was off the coast of the Orkneys, off the northeast coast of Scotland.
Right.
And it wasn't far from the Orkneys. Now, the reason why they always thought that sank much earlier was because they didn't take into consideration the idea of the ice pushing down on Scotland and the north of Britain. Basically, the north of Britain had this 2-mile ice. When you got south of the Thames, it was a lot more reasonable, just a few feet, which meant that when the ice melted, there was no longer this massive pressure pushing down on the north of Scotland. And over many years, centuries, it gradually started to rise up. So as the waters rose, so was this area of Doggerland, which was just off the coast of the Orkneys. So it stayed above sea level a lot longer than anyone thought. And it didn't sink really until about 4,000 BC. Some people think it was still there around parts of it around 3,500 BC. Right. In other words, the very time that this island finally sinks is the time that the megalithic culture suddenly appears on the Orkneys. So could it have come from there? Well, my idea was always yes, I'm pretty sure it did. And it's only recently that there is actual archaeological evidence that it did come from there. And that was because archaeologists have, completely by accident, it was an undersea survey of the North Sea for purposes of oil exploration and all that sort of thing. And they discovered a few short distance off the coast of the Orkneys an underwater stone circle. Now, on the land, on the Orkneys, there's a stone circle called the Ring of Brodgar.
Right.
And it's a kind of mini, I described Avebury earlier. It's a mini version of that. It's about half the size. So it's still pretty big.
Yeah.
Ditch and embankment, around 50 stones, some of them about 10 feet high. Evidence of avenues of stones nearby, artificial hill. Just like I described Avebury, it was a megalithic complex. The dating has been, people have been dating it to around about 2,500 BC. But because it seems to link up with another stone circle that's been dated earlier than that, which is the stones of Stennes I mentioned earlier, the oldest stone circle, the Ring of Brodgar could be a lot older than that. In other words, it could date to about 3,000 BC. Anyway, regardless of exactly when it was built, what they found on the seabed was almost an identical version of the Ring of Brodgar, but like 20 feet under the sea.
Right.
And how long would it have taken to actually sink down to that level, or the sea to rise? That has got to date from around 4,000 BC, else it wouldn't be on the bottom of the sea where it is.
Oh.
In other words, no one's going to build something on the bottom of the sea like that before they had, well, no one's going to do it now, but you'd have to have diving equipment. Yeah. So they obviously built it on the land, and for the water to rise by the amount it has, mean it's got a date to at least 4,000 BC. This shows that, and this particular place was on the edge of what was northern Doggerland, the last little island to actually sink below the waves. So in other words, there was a megalithic civilization on Doggerland before there was one on the Orkneys. So I know it's only one stone circle so far, but they're going to be doing over the next few years a lot more sophisticated marine archaeology in the North Sea, and we'll see just how many other stone circles and megalithic structures there are. But it's pretty obvious now that is where this civilization started. And if you like, that's why I describe it in the book as an Atlantis of the North. It isn't Atlantis, that's somewhere around the Mediterranean or the Atlantic, but it is similar. It is a sunken civilization.
Right.
Some of them managed to survive and come to what's now the British Isles and eventually build Stonehenge.
Right. I think what interests me about that as well is that even though it's submerged very long time ago, and there's a lot of indication there, as you're suggesting, that it's older than the structures in the Orkneys. That I know there's a lot of speculation and interest in some of these structures being aligned to ancient astronomy. And even then, I wonder where the alignment was. I mean, there's a lot of talk about northern structures being aligned to Cygnus, and even going down to Egypt, etc., and the pyramids at that time. I know there's some arguments about Orion's belt or it's Cygnus or whatever. In my view, it's Cygnus, but that's just the way I'm kind of biased, really. Particularly when you look at some of the carvings around him. In Avebury, this is when I used to know Andy and his group, etc., that I found a swan-headed serpent carved on one of the stones in the avenue, probably still there. I've got photographs of this, and that whole idea about shamans and birds, and even in Nordic cultures about lining burial chambers with goose feathers, and you see psychopomp and the transition period. So it wouldn't surprise me if these older structures weren't connected with that either, and yet the stories came down once there was a civilization in what's now the British Isles. I don't know about your views on that, but
well, I certainly think that obviously these stones had a very great importance to these people. I mean, I've speculated what that might have been, or some of the stones that were built for in my book, which the one that was before that, which I can't remember the name of now, whatever it was called.
Was it that?
Oh yeah, Wisdom Keepers of
Stonehenge.
That's what it was called. Anyway,
yeah,
that's another story. But recently, again, they have just discovered that the altar stone from Stonehenge, which they always thought came from South Wales with the other blue stones. In fact, now the only place that's got the same kind of stone as that altar's made from is around the Orkneys, on the Orkneys, and also off the coast of the Orkneys and what was part of North Doggerland, where this other stone circle has been discovered. Now, some people say, well, it was an erratic. In other words, it was a stone carried down from some of the Orkneys with the ice during the Ice Age and deposited there. But, it seems more likely that this stone now was cut, used up at the Orkneys or somewhere in that area off the north coast of Scotland, and then brought all the way down. If they can bring stones across from Wales to Stonehenge, they can certainly bring this. I mean, it's just going to take longer. So, put it on boats, on barges, sometimes drag it across ice at other times, roll it along. I mean, we know that somewhere like Stonehenge or Avebury took generations to build, of half the population of southern England being involved in building these things. Whatever they were for, they were very important. So dragging a stone down from the Orkneys isn't much compared to that. They certainly had the personnel, the time and the will, some reason to do it. So it must have been like the stones, like in the same way that the stones brought from South Wales to Stonehenge were obviously they were considered important. So must have this altar stone, or maybe it was one standing up. It was obviously an important stone that came from the Orkneys that when they went south, they wanted to take with them. Also, there's a possibility that this could have come from a stone circle that was once on the lost North Doggerland Island.
Yes. Yeah.
They certainly had incredible technologies, Neolithic technology for the time, because there is one part of North Doggerland that still survives above water. What was once high land on the northern part of the isle, about 50 miles north of the Orkneys, is a place called Fair Isle. If you ever listen to the shipping forecast, you hear them talk about Fair Isle. Well, that's where that is, and the area around there. It's a tiny island, but archaeologists have recently been up there and they've discovered some remarkable things. Going back to over 4000 BC, that's over 6,000 years ago, they have found evidence of houses very similar to those on the Orkneys, these underground ones. They have found evidence that the people built, well, they haven't found evidence, they know for a fact now that they built saunas. In other words, they've got places with fires in there where charcoal was burned and other little cubicles around it, which could have, there's no evidence that they were firing pottery or trying to do anything with smelting copper or anything like this. They were simply sitting in hot rooms. That is a sauna. Well, saunas weren't thought to have been invented in Finland for centuries later. Another thing they were able to do, and seemingly as a way of trying to hold back the waters as the waters rose, they obviously didn't realize it was going to stop, leaving this last bit, but they started building walls. But what they were able to do to these walls is to actually heat them to such an extent that they melted, and they formed these melted stones together to form these walls that were virtually impenetrable. Now, the Iron Age Britons in Scotland did this, but that was done thousands of years later. They were basically creating these vitrified forts, as they're called, centuries, millennia before anybody else was able to do it. I mean, to actually create that kind of heat is pretty impressive. You have to burn stuff in a particular way for hours and days on end, and you have to have a certain amount of technology to do this. Technology which was like Iron Age technology, not technology from this pretty much still the Stone Age. So if that's just something to give us a sneak kind of look at how advanced the people of North Doggerland was, you know, they must have been pretty advanced.
Incredible.
And such a big stone like the altar stone at Stonehenge would have been no problem them moving it down.
Do we know what type of stone it is? The altar stone.
I think I can't remember. I think it's something feldspar, maybe.
Maybe. I'm just because the reason why I'm asking is that it's interesting to think about humans, isn't it? That we are kind of driven to being attracted by stones, if not precious stones, but stones in itself, you know, the geological properties of things and all that good stuff about certain resonance of rocks and psychometry and things like this and what we pick up and what we're driven by, etc., you know, and maybe that the civilizations of Doggerland were quite in tune with things like this, and therefore one of the reasons of maybe carrying the altar stone so far down is that yes, maybe it once belonged somewhere else, but also it carries meaning and purpose for other civilizations. So which is lost now, obviously, but it's part of our retaining a culture.
Well, I think it probably had it was similar to that culture as the Ark of the Covenant was to the ancient Israelites. When the ancient Israelites moved out of Egypt, according to the Bible, they're wandering around in the Sinai wilderness, in no man's land. They're wandering around. They are nomads for 40 years, according to the Bible. Now, while they're nomads, they obviously need some kind of temple. Now, the idea in Egypt and other early civilizations like Samaria in Mesopotamia and so forth, is that they believed that a statue of a god, a stone statue of a god or a goddess or a being, enabled communication with that being. Now, when you read in the Bible, I think this is what's happening in Egypt. This is what the Israelites knew before they were taken out by Moses or whoever historically led them out of Egypt. And it's quite clear that they were used to worshipping these idols, because one of the first things the Bible tells us that they do when they reach Mount Sinai is to build use the gold they've taken from Egypt to build a golden calf that they start to worship. And Moses goes nuts at this. But after this, he says, use this gold to make the Ark of the Covenant. And what we carry around in that, what do we carry around in it? The 2 Ten Commandment stones that are supposed to be inscribed by God that Moses brings down from the mountain. They put it in the ark, they carry it around. Right. Now, in Egypt, they've just taken this idea directly from Egypt. In Tutankhamun's tomb, for example, there is an ark. The Egyptians called it a bark, which is another word for a barge. Yeah. It shows the head of, that shows the god Anubis, the jackal-headed god, on the top. It's got poles you can carry it with. Inside, there was kept stones sacred to Anubis. So these stones, which were inscribed with various things to sort of, to conjure Anubis, were carried around in this box. They were put on a barge, taken down the Nile. It was a portable temple. They needed these stones in order to communicate with their gods. Now, this is what the Hebrews, the Israelites, are doing in the wilderness. Now, in other words, they've got 2 stones that were blessed by God. On top of the ark, we've got 2 angels that seem to represent these 2 stones, the angels of God, in the same way as the Anubis statue represented the Anubis stones in Egypt. Now, think about it. When we read the Bible, it says, and God said unto the Israelites, and God said unto Moses, and God, how is God doing this speaking? The idea, if it is similar to what is happening in Egypt, somebody is standing, a priest, trained priest, stands next to the box, goes off into a trance and communicates the words of Anubis or whatever god is in this bark.
Yes.
Represented in the bark. Well, obviously, some priest or prophet stands next to the ark and conveys whatever the message is to Moses and the Israelites. I would guess that's a sensible idea,
Yeah.
Right. Okay. There's many civilizations that did this same sort of thing. I've mentioned the Sumerians. The early Hittites had something very similar. In China, they had something very similar. They carry around sort of carvings of different deities in a box, and they'd move it around. Okay. Let us say that this stone that's been brought to Stonehenge was an important mobile temple, if you like. It's a big stone, but if you know how to move these stones around, it can be moved as you gradually move your center of civilization further south. Right. So I think it was something that people stood next to an ancient priest or whatever you call these people, and they directed people with the messages from the gods, the deities, the spirit world, or whatever they believed they were in communication. It's a radio for talking to God.
Yes, even embraced, maybe. That's not out of our imagination, is it? There are 2 things that spring to mind. Maybe I'm just crazy today, but I'm thinking about when people pass on in various different religions and they're buried and whatever, and a lot of grieving people, they embrace the coffin almost as if they need to touch the memory of somebody inside, etc. And then yet, if it's not that and we're cremated, then we put those ashes, which are carbon, into an urn, which is much the same thing in a lot of ways, that we embrace that idea as well and carry these things and release them or keep them. In Italy, you're not allowed to even spread the ashes. That's illegal, right? Which is quite interesting.
But you have to keep them all together in a pot.
Right, can we put a pot somewhere, and it's recorded where that is by the police. But I think then, and momentarily, don't ask me.
I want to be spread on the motorway, on the M1.
Well, yeah, anywhere like that'd be great. Yeah, yes, keep it moving, and it's just really fascinating. I'm just thinking about them carrying this quite large altar stone. Maybe that was carried on some sort of vessel, like a bark, something like this. It was a long ceremonial journey of taking the phone, because they didn't have mobile devices, so taking the phone down from there to there so we can...
it would have been pretty difficult for people to carry it like the Ark of the Covenant, but they could have rolled it around. It would have been, the general thinking of how they'd move the stones from South Wales the Preseli Mountains to Stonehenge
Yeah.
is mainly by water.
Yeah.
They were able to create barges. That's not a problem. And then they see where the stone circle was in the Preseli Mountains is only about 10 miles from the coast.
Yeah.
Now, you may be out, the thinking is they got it around the coast, then they went down the Bristol Channel, then they went down the River Avon, and they can do that all the way to within about 5 miles from Stonehenge. You can do it like that.
Yeah.
That is one way. Trying to do it all the way from the Orkneys, I mean, I don't know. I mean, what kind of seas do you have? I mean, you'd have to take it fairly well out to sea if you're going down the east coast of. So I would imagine if you're going down rivers, and you'd certainly have to do a lot of pulling it across land as well.
Yeah.
But people were capable of doing some pretty amazing things if they believed in something. If you've got enough people, you can pull it easily. They proved that by, building the Stonehenge things. I mean, whether it was done like this by pulling it on rollers, who knows? But archaeologists and TV shows and Tony Robinson and people like that have got together like 200 volunteers and pulled these stones around on rollers. So it can be done.
Yes. Yes.
And they had plenty more people than that to work with. And for every person they had pulling things along and digging holes and digging ditches and embankments and things, they had about another 10 people behind them in sort of logistics, feeding them, growing crops.
It's cultivated engineering mind, isn't it? Yeah, really.
There's thousands of people involved in these things. There must have been for people to say they must have had some practical purpose, I believe that they did, but it doesn't necessarily mean they all did. I mean, what was the practical purposes of the Greek cathedrals of Europe? The practical purpose is it scared the crap out of people and it held people together as one unified, Christendom, or at least it gave kings the power, because in the days before TV, radio, and surveillance, how does you can decide to disobey the king if you want, but you won't if you think that king's appointed by God and God's watching you. So the church was important. So the cathedrals had a great importance, and if it wasn't for the cathedrals, medieval Europe would never have advanced or stuck together. So it's a psychological side to why these things were important. Why were the pyramids built in Egypt? Was it just because some king was vain enough to want himself, hidden inside one of them? The fact of the matter is that these things obviously had a great sociological, if that's the right word, geopolitical purpose. I don't even know what the word is. They don't have to be so obvious, like, they're used to observe the stars so that we can plant crops, which is what I think a lot of them were used for. Right. But these massive ones are just too big for the purpose.
No. And like you say, all of these things, even if we look at all sorts of other cultures, they all, at these focus points, they all have something, or what pertains to be a focus point, a stone, a place, a plinth for something, as, like you say, that area of transmission, maybe. I mean, you said a lot of things today, Graham, we're truly grateful for. I've got two last questions, if you don't mind. The first one is, what's the importance of this stuff for us? What do you think that might be?
Well, there are a number of important points about what, Doggerland, for example. Yeah. Firstly, if people don't think that it's dangerous for the Earth to be getting hotter and sea levels to be rising, then think of places like Doggerland. These people were almost wiped out by it. I talk about in my book many other coastal early proto-civilizations in Mexico, in China, Japan, the Middle East, that were wiped out when the waters rose. Some of them were able to go inland, but you go inland, you find yourself on other people's property. Other people are growing crops. Crops become more scarce than war. And that's one reason to take notice of that. But if you happen to be a climate change denier or don't think that's that important, the other thing is to remember that people were sophisticatedly doing stuff way before we ever thought they were. Civilization was thought to have started in around about 3000 BC in Egypt, Samaria, also in the Indus Valley in what's now Pakistan and part of India. But these cultures, these sophisticated cultures, were going on thousands of years before that. Pretty quickly after the Ice Age, they were starting to get together, build decent settlements. They were able to start making pottery, and the most important thing, they suddenly learned how to do agriculture, to start domesticating animals, and to start planting crops rather than being nomadic hunter-gatherers. Now, in other words, the sophistication of something like the megalithic civilization, people thought until recently, well, there's lots of different local tribes and they had very little to do with each other. But moving stones all the way down from one place to another, building exactly the same kind of structures over the whole British Isles, shows some kind of civilization. Yep. It may not have had the kind of buildings that the ancient Egyptians had, but it was in a civilization in touch with each other, with the same beliefs and the same rules and the same system of what they did. And how did they do this without any form of writing? Well, my belief is that they did so by that they had a kind of a priesthood, if you like, but not just the people who said worship this god or that god. They had an elite set of people whose job it was to remember everything by using mnemonic techniques, by sharing the burden between them. And why do I think this? Because later, the Celtic Druids, who said that they gained their knowledge from the earlier people who built the stone circles, are reported by people like Julius Caesar of having astonishing memories to remember the tribal history, their religion, to remember how to smelt metals, to remember how to build. In other words, it was a civilization with a form of writing without writing. In other words, the people who were at the stone circles, these precursors of the Druids, were the libraries of the megalithic civilization. Hence, I call the first book I did before about the megalith people, the wisdom keepers of Stonehenge. These people were the wisdom keepers, and there's a lot of evidence that they existed in their tombs. Right. So there's a few reasons why it's important to know this stuff. Right. Because, put it this way, if we end up going back into sort of almost like a Stone Age existence because of climate change, world wars, and just about everything else that seems to be being thrown at us in the next few years, we may need to start this all over again.
Yeah, it wouldn't be surprising, really, would it? And that whole idea of languages and stories, traditions, etc. And like you mentioned, Julius Caesar talking about what we knew about how to hold on to our records and things like this. It's an interesting thing, and there are different forms of writing and how we do that as well. So, even drawing is writing. It's the same thing, really. I
know some people actually have suggested that the stones could actually contain some sort of information. Like there is a theory. I mean, I'm not saying I necessarily believe in this, but I'm just saying what's been suggested. There has been a theory that came around in the 1970s, I think, called the stone tape theory, based on a TV show by Nigel Neal, was that stones, a building stone and rocks and bricks in a building, can hold memory of an event, and people can then pick up on that and see it replayed as a kind of vision, which is where ghosts come from. And they called it the stone tape theory, like recording something onto a tape recorder or film, video or whatever. And some people have actually put forward the idea that these stones, the stone circles, were actually used to hold information. So you've got all these people, these precursors to the Druids, who were both incidentally men and women. They didn't segregate. They were both men and women who who spent time within these stone circles, doing whatever they did to improve their memories and keep all the various things they had to in their heads. But at the same time, some people suggest we're able to imprint this information into the stones. Now, I don't know how you imprint it or how you play it back, but Some people have seriously suggested that.
Yeah. Yeah, because it all kind of connects with sort of our inner levels of awareness, really. And I think a lot of that's been lost, and a lot of that gets completely crushed by technology as well, because we lose those abilities. Um, and going back to things like psychometry and being able to read certain things and try and piece those things together. But
I
yeah,
remember that there was
yeah.
actually a project to try and sort of test this at the Roll Whitestones years ago called the Dragon Project, of which
Oh,
quite a few people were involved in. I think Caroline Wise was involved
I
in it
think
at
she
some point.
was, yeah.
And they
Yeah,
actually picked up quite
right.
some strange signals coming from the stones.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think it's entirely possible. I mean, it's not beyond the imagination, or is it, it doesn't escape us these days. We are actually becoming quite a much more creative within our imaginations these days. I think it's because even though I slate technology for lots of reasons, my own, I think sometimes it gives us windows of being more imaginative. But let's see where that goes. And I'm thinking just to end today's. I mean, it's been so rich. It's given me lots of things to think about. I'm sure that listeners will be bouncing around with this stuff. And I do urge to buy the book. In fact, all your books. We've got a few in our bookshelves.
Oh,
Oh yeah, without a doubt. Yeah,
so
goes way
this bookshelf behind me, that's
yeah.
all of mine. That's
Right.
only my book.
Right, there you go. That's a lot of them. I think we've probably got about 6 or 7 of those. But they do stir the imagination, and they do make us think. So I'm wondering what's next for you, Graham.
I can't really tell anybody because
Oh,
it's
all
kind
right.
of all hush. But I can tell you part of it.
All right.
Okay, I've got a new book I'm putting together for the publisher now.
Yeah.
I can't talk about,
No.
but the book that's already at the publishers and hasn't been published yet is about an investigation into astrology and does it really work?
Ah. Oh, that's very cool. Astrology.
Astrology. Does
Astrology.
it really work?
Does it work? And when do you think that might be out?
Knowing the publisher about a year.
Right. Okay.
Oh, but I've got another book that I'm doing with
Yeah.
Jodie Russell.
Yes.
We did a book last year, the one called Strange Fate. We
Ah.
published that one out.
Yeah, that's it.
Another one about Alice in Wonderland coming out later in the year, who she was, who inspired Alice in Wonderland, and a haunted mirror that is supposed to have inspired the
Right.
Looking Glass story.
I think, on a personal note, Alice played a very large part in my research thesis. Back to academia, isn't it? And she played those 2 books played a large part in that, in terms of the investigation of the self. But one bit I found in the second book, Through Looking Glass, which actually chills me, it's happening right now as I speak about it, is when Alice comes across the Red King asleep in the forest. And of course, I think it's Tweedledum who says to her, because she wants to wake the Red King up, and says, I want to wake him up, or something like this. And Tweedledum says, no, don't do that, because you'll vanish. And she said, why is that? And she said, because you're in his dream, and that's where you exist. And it's this kind of existential, freaky, frightening note that do you actually exist anyway? And all kind of that good stuff. So, Charles Dodgson, etc., wrote those books. There's something going on about an
Well,
understanding of something else.
we're trying to, I mean, I've got an actual,
There
quite
we
an
are.
old,
There she is. Lovely. Yeah.
I think it might be Victorian or something,
It
quite
looks
old.
very much so. That's,
I mean,
yeah.
the modern ones. Here's a modern one. I'm surrounding myself with things. Whatever I investigate, I surround myself with
Yeah.
things to
Me
inspire.
too. Me too. They're so
I'm gonna have
important.
to get stone circle rocks in here.
Right. Well, you could always build a henge in your front room. But anyway,
Build a henge.
But it's been great. Thank you so much for today.
Thank you very much indeed for having me on.
It's splendid. I mean, maybe next year we'll talk again, see where you're at. That'll be great too. But for now,
Cool.
I think that's a whole vast, complicated thought structure that you shared with us, and I'm certainly going to be thinking about for the next few days. Um, going to say bye now, and I'm going to play out some fantastically super music for you for today's show. But all the best. Keep carrying on, Graham. I think we need you out there doing this stuff, and go well.
Thank you very much.